Andy and Wes here from Apologetics Canada. We're in Egypt working on a new project called Can I Trust the Bible?
But you might be asking the question, well, why are Andy and I here in Egypt to talk about the complexities and issues regarding the Bible? Well, the reality of it is the vast majority of those handwritten copies, what we call the manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly the earliest ones, come from Egypt.
And with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, skeptics of all different stripes, and all of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that if that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
We're here in Washington, D.C., starting filming on our newest episode of Can I Trust the Bible?
We're visiting the Museum of the Bible to look at some key artifacts and historic Bibles that help tell us how we got the Bible.
And in fact, one of the key artifacts that we're here to see, which is currently on loan from the Israeli Antiquities Authority, is called the Megiddo Mosaic.
It's being described as the most important archaeological discovery outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and is not only our earliest example of a church building from the early 3rd century, this is direct evidence of Jesus being associated as God in the life of the worship of the church. This is arguably our oldest example of a place of worship, a church from the early 3rd century, and Jesus is right there inscribed on the floor in the mosaic as being described as God.
You ready to do this?
Let's do it.
Well, I'm excited to be with you this afternoon. Hopefully, given the time of day, I can make sure that you're awake, not putting you to sleep at this point in the day after you've ingested all those carbs. I'll do my best. But we're going to tackle the topic, is the Bible just a collection of myths and legends? In other words, what I want to do is I want to tackle the topic, is the Bible true? However, before we kind of address that head on and address some of maybe the objections you've heard in regards to the Bible being a collection of myth and legends, we have to get some definitions out of the way, because we use the term the Bible and often think of it as this, and this is what the Bible is. But the Bible didn't fall out of the sky looking like this. There are all sorts of things that we can say about the Bible historically and scientifically and philosophically, some of which we've heard already today. But what I want to address is the fact that though we have the Bible in this form as it exists now, the Bible is not one book as much as it's 66 books. 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by close to 40 different authors in 3 different languages. 2 major languages, Greek and Hebrew, and 1 minor language, Aramaic. And so, in one way, the Bible is not one book as much as it's a mini library, an anthology of books that span a lot of time and a lot of culture and a lot of different groups. And so, in that sense, sometimes when we talk about the Bible, there's a hurdle in that people might not even really know what we mean about the Bible if we use that term. However, it is helpful to clarify to people when we're talking about the Old Testament versus the New Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus versus Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and get those forms of the history and categories correct. We also likewise need to understand what we mean if we're talking about the Bible being true, what we mean by the word true. There are different ways that we can parse out what we even mean when we use the term true. And what I want to do is I want to go through some of those categories, some of the ways that we break down the definition of truth and use them as an example of finitely, obviously, I'm not going to exhaustively address all the ways that the Bible could be true, but address some of the objections for Christianity in the Bible being true under the definition of truth being in accordance with fact and or reality, communicating accurately, and conveying honestly. And so if we start with our first criteria, if we start with the Bible being true in accordance with fact and or reality, what this question is about is simply, is this trustworthy as history? And obviously that encompasses different areas. We heard Scott talk about the Old Testament. There's a lot of ways that we can dig into the Exodus and other areas that validate its truthfulness. But I want to focus primarily in this presentation, not exclusively, but primarily on the Gospels, because as you heard me say in that intro video for our Can I Trust the Bible series, the Gospels are the place where we get the biographical information about Jesus. And if we look at the Gospels from the lens of history, we find that the Gospels go to lengths to communicate historical accuracy.
Luke goes to lengths to demonstrate that his narrative is placed within an actual time and location. In the first 3 verses of Luke chapter 3, we are not only given 7 historical characters that mark out the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, but within these 3 verses alone are 22 historical references to locations and people that have been verified by archaeology and ancient literary sources outside of the Bible. This places Luke's account within a historical framework, making sure his readers know he's not merely making up a story, but pinpointing when and where these events actually took place in history. And the gospel authors do this in multiple different ways, with names, locations, as well as with accurate plant and animal life related to the areas within the narratives they are describing. The gospel authors get these types of facts right, even when other ancient writers of the time don't.
And there are some different ways that the gospel authors get this right, where others don't, in that we have an ancient writer named Tacitus. One of the ancient writers who writes about ancient Roman leaders and Caesars is Tacitus. He makes 2 minor errors, though, in one of his most prominent writings in talking about this time frame that he is categorizing. First, when talking about Jesus, when talking about this group of believers that are referred to as Christians, he wrongly assumes that Christus is a personal name rather than a title. He thinks this sounds like a name. He doesn't have the framework religiously to understand that Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, Mashiach, the Anointed One. And so he wrongly assumes that this is a man called Christus. Secondly, and this is the one that relates to our discussion here, he gives Pontius Pilate the wrong title. Pilate was commissioned not as a procurator, but as a governor. And this is backed up by archaeology. A stone inscription found in Caesarea Maritime on the coast of Israel confirms this, where we have an inscriptional title given to Pontius Pilate from a commissioning stone that agrees with who? The gospel authors when they refer to him as the governor. Because the title of this talk is the Bible just a collection of myths and legends? Let me show you what something like the preface of Luke's gospel looks like up against an actual myth and legend. Luke, as I mentioned in that clip that I played, is going to lengths to communicate his historical accuracy. And Luke communicates for us his purpose statement right off the bat at the beginning of his biography of Jesus. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us from those who were first eyewitnesses and servants of the word." With this in mind, Luke says, since he himself has carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that have been taught. Luke's preface parallels other prefaces we see in literary and scientific writings in the ancient world by guys like Demetrius or Galen or Lucian. Other ancient writers write prefaces and they give their thesis statements, and Luke's actually is very similar to many of these other ones. In contrast, when we look at something like the beginning of the Iliad, it says this: rage, sing goddess Achilles' rage, black and murderous that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched the countless souls of heroes into Hades' dark and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds, as Zeus's will be done. Begin with clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and godlike Achilles, which of the immortals set these two at each other's throats. Apollo, Zeus's son, and Letos, offended by the warlord Agamemnon, had dishonored Caiaphas, Apollo's priest, so that the god struck the Greek camp with a plague and the soldiers were dying. There's a difference there, which I think should be obvious. One is writing an epic poem, Homer, and one is writing history, Luke. And we see this if we're fielding accusations of it being a myth or a legend or something like that. We can actually look at epic poems and myths and legends from ancient antiquity and see how something like the Gospels stand up to that kind of comparison. And it's not just the New Testament. We can look at corroborative evidence for narrative stories in the Old Testament as well. Let me give you a quick one. If you have your Bible and you open up to 2 Kings 18, you'll find a story about Hezekiah. It says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent the message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand of me. The king of Assyria exacted from Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Now, it's interesting that prior to very recently, if you were to go in your time machine back to, say, the 13th century and ask a monk who was Sennacherib, king of Assyria, what they would do is they would open up to 2 Kings, and they would look at that and say, well, he's the king of Assyria. He besieged Judah, and he thwarted Lachish and put Jerusalem under a siege. And for a long time, whether it's Sennacherib or a number of other of these ancient rulers from the ancient Near East, the Bible was our first source. And I think that's important. That means something. And interestingly enough, as time goes on, when we stick shovels in the ground, we find corroborative evidence for individuals like Sennacherib, king of Assyria. If you go to the British Museum, you can enter a room that includes a wall relief of Sennacherib, king of Assyria's throne room from 2,700 years ago. The room originally included a series of floor-to-ceiling carvings 40 feet tall, depicting the Assyrian conquest over Lachish, which was the second most important city in the kingdom of Judah after Jerusalem itself. And in the year 701 BC, Sennacherib led a vast army against Judah, as both the biblical and historical records tell us. My computer is recording everything I'm saying for some reason, so I'm just going to stop that. Not sure why it's doing that. So we have this floor-to-ceiling relief. And in the year 701 BC, Sennacherib led a vast army against Judah, as both the biblical and historical record tells us. King Hezekiah had rebelled against the Assyrians and was now confronted with the world's greatest war machine. Sennacherib led a conquest in destroying 46 cities across the coast of Israel until he finally arrived at Lachish. And this relief was discovered in 1845 in what is modern-day Iraq, and it describes in graphic and gory detail Assyrian conquests with pictures of soldiers, siege machines, battering rams, rows of sling throwers and archers, finally climaxing with an image of Sennacherib himself sitting atop his throne while the spoils of Judah are brought before him by his captors. And we see just above Sennacherib an inscription in Akkadian cuneiform, the language that would have been used in that day, that says, Sennacherib, king of the universe, king of Assyria, sits on a throne, and the spoils of Lachish are parked before him. This is corroborative evidence of what we see in the story in 2 Kings. This is something that we can look to that is an external source that verifies this particular event. In the palace room was also found a clay hexagonal prism with writing on each side. This is known as the tailor's prism. And among the war campaigns listed on both sides, we read about how Hezekiah, king of Judah, was not subservient to Sennacherib's authority, but was besieged, and specifically it says that Sennacherib shut Hezekiah up like a bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. So this is an interesting corroborative piece of archaeological data that we have that puts something like 2 Kings in a category that describes it not as a myth, not as a legend, but allows us to put it on a timeline where we can see that it's talking about real people and real places and real times. So whether it's the preface of the Gospel of Luke and sort of the corroborative data that we see in places like Luke chapter 3, with him going to lengths to preface the ministry of John the Baptist, which he doesn't need to do, or it's him laying out his thesis statement at the beginning and saying, this is why I'm doing this, and we can see that it kind of mirrors how other ancient historians are doing it. This helps us as modern individuals, as historians or otherwise, to picture these stories within a particular framework of history. Now, the caveat to this is that we can't do this for every story in the Bible, nor do I think it's necessarily realistic to expect to find something like Abraham's tent or, Moses' robe or something like that. That's not what archaeology is for, and I hope I'm not overstepping my boundaries with an actual archaeologist in the room. But archaeology is not a silver bullet. However, it's this very useful tool that we have in our tool belt to say that this isn't objective truth of one thing happening or another, but it's saying we can corroborate this data to fill out the picture and say there is reasonable ground for a person who is fair-minded to say the Bible's not talking about made-up stories. It's not talking about made-up places and made-up times. And so it can be used as corroborative data. And in that way, I think we can say that the Bible is true in accordance with fact and or reality based on the evidence. Well, what about communicating accurately? Well, there are two ways that I want to evaluate this: internally and externally. Now, with the question of internal accuracy, we're asking as to whether the stories we find in the Bible are not just talking about a time, but have evidence of being descriptions from witnesses during that time period specifically. With external accuracy, it's a bit of a different question. It's an attempt to answer the question, is what we have now what the original authors wrote? Because the most recent book that was written in this collection of books is still about 2,000 years old. And so how do we know over the last 2 millennia that this wasn't changed by scribes or kings or popes or what have you in this long game of telephone until it gets to us today? How do we know that what I have written in my modern English translation is what the original authors wrote? Well, Brian mentioned that my doctoral work is in the New Testament. I study early scribal features. This is what I know you're all interested in. Everybody's interested in early scribal features. And what I do is I look at how ancient writing is done. The first types of writing, as we saw Scott kind of exemplify, were done on tablets. They inscribed things on tablets. And the tablets were eventually replaced with scrolls, higher form of technology. And scrolls were eventually replaced with the codex, the book. Now, nowadays, we scroll through books on tablets. I'm doing a PhD. Are we going forwards, backwards? It's not part of my dissertation. But let me just say this, and this might not be where you think I'd go, but names in the Bible are actually really important, really key to placing the biblical Gospels within a window of the living memory of eyewitnesses.
A series of scholarly studies has shown that, though Jews were located in many places across the Roman Empire, people's names often tended to be geographically located. By observing literary and archaeological artifacts, a list of common names can be clearly identified. By narrowing down the most popular names in places that Jesus lived, traveled, and ministered, and by comparing these to the list from the studies, an interesting correlation can be seen. Just as we see today with popular names, a qualifier or nickname is often used. For example, Notice that when Matthew lists the disciples in his gospel, certain names have a qualifier or nickname and others do not. Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. As we would expect, the most popular names are those that have an added description. When we compare the most popular names in Judea and Galilee during the first century with the names we see listed in places like the biblical Gospels, we find that all of the names with qualifiers match with what we'd assume if they were actually written in the time and place they claim to be narrating. In contrast, the Gospel of Judas only has 2 names that would fit, Jesus and Judas, but contains a host of other characters whose names match not with first century Galilee and Judea, like biblical Gospels, but with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Consider how difficult it would be for someone living outside of the locations and times that these events took place to get the right names with the right qualifiers. We have 4 biblical Gospels with 4 different named authors, and yet each gets this test of naming frequency and attribution right every time. A test and standard that the Apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels simply do not pass.
We can imagine this in that when I was in high school in Elliott Lake, there were certain names that were very popular. There was a whole bunch of Michaels and a whole bunch of Matthews and a whole bunch of Sarahs. And so how do you know when you yell into the gym which one you're talking to, right? Which Michael is going to respond? Is it going to be the one you actually want to be talking to? And so you use disambiguators or qualifiers. Those are words that Wikipedia told me are the description of these things. And so you use those types of terms, right? Tall Michael, short Michael, or use the first letter of their last name, or some type of descriptive qualifier. And it's actually not as easy as you might think for you to write a story about even, let's say, the 90s in Elliott Lake and get the exact right names that were popular in 1995 in Elliott Lake in that year for that geographical location. We obviously know names that are popular today, and we might assume that those names are popular back then. And this is exactly what we see when we look at the Gnostic and Apocryphal Gospels. We see that they're assuming that there are certain names within the time that they're writing in places like 4th century Egypt or 2nd and 3rd century Syria. And so what they do is they know, well, these are Jewish names. These are names that we're familiar with. And so they add these other characters into the narrative without realizing that some of these names don't even exist within the 1st century, within the beginning of the 1st century in Galilee, in Judea, in this region of Roman-occupied territory. And so that's what we find. We find that the internal ability to qualify and relay accuracy based on name frequency. This is a study that's called onomastic congruence. You're all going to memorize that. It's going to be on the test tomorrow, so you make sure you got it. Onomastic congruence. It's a fun word to say. This is what that's about. Looking at names, looking at the frequencies, looking at the disambiguators. And so there are a host of reasons, including this, why those Gospels that maybe you've heard about being left out of the Bible or removed from the Bible. Those are kind of misnomers. They were never removed because they were never there to begin with. But the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Philip, these were not written in the time frame when those people whose names are associated with them were even alive. And so we can rule them out because Thomas was dead by the time the Gospel of Thomas was actually penned. And we know that both by internal and external categories of investigation. The second category, though, in terms of this accuracy is what I mentioned before. Is what we have now what the original authors wrote back then? Because there's some use in saying, okay, we can look at some of the internal accuracy and maybe that verifies something. Maybe we can actually even verify that we have the right books. I should be looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and not Thomas, Peter, Mary, and Judas. But those are old. Those are 2,000 years old. So how do I know that what I have now in this collection of translations is what the original authors wrote?
When we look back at how we actually go from ancient papyrus to modern-day print, the history of the Bible is not some sort of layered web of translations. In reality, What we find ourselves with is a single step, going from the original Hebrew and Greek directly into our Bibles today. The translation of the Bible takes into consideration an amazing collection of archaeological evidence, from discoveries in Israel like the Dead Sea Scrolls, to papyri dug up in places like Oxyrhynchus. Over time, as we've uncovered more of these fragments and manuscripts, they haven't complicated our understanding of the Bible, but clarified it. The documents that sit behind the history of the Bible and the way that we translate them today gives us confidence in their reliability to go from the original languages into our own. Even though we're almost 2,000 years removed from the last book of the Bible that was written, as discoveries are made, we are not getting farther away from the text, but getting closer. This evidence confirms and gives us good reason to trust that our Bibles have been faithfully and accurately copied, and that what we have now is what the original authors wrote.
And let me pick on a statement you just heard me say. As time goes on, we're not getting farther away from the original, but we're actually getting closer. And let me illustrate this to you by picking on the King James Bible. The King James Bible was translated between 1604 and 1611, and it wasn't translated from manuscripts, ancient handwritten copies of the Old and New Testament, but translated from printed editions that existed in that time frame, particularly one major printed edition of the Hebrew Old Testament from 1545, and then five editions of a guy named Desiderius Erasmus, and then two updates, Stephanus and Beza's New Testaments. And so what those were an amalgamation of, though, if we're looking at the New Testament, is that of those printed editions of the Greek New Testament that the King James translators were using, that was formulated based upon approximately 31 manuscripts available at that time, the earliest of which, the major one that was used, went back to the 11th century. Now, those were good manuscripts. This is not to pick on the King James Bible and say that it is somehow unreliable. What they were using in the 17th century for production of the King James Bible was an excellent grouping of what they had at that time. However, the caveat to that is that if we skip ahead to the 21st century, to 2025, we've discovered all sorts of other manuscripts, other pieces of corroborative evidence that shed more light on the text, give us greater confidence to be able to say that this is based on what Christians have read all the way along. Not only do we know of those 31 manuscripts that sat at the heart of Erasmus's third edition of the Greek New Testament, but we have 5,000 others, the earliest of which go back to the 2nd century. And if we're talking about important manuscripts, there are all sorts of ones that I could highlight. There's P66, a late 2nd century copy of the Gospel of John that preserves for us an almost entire copy of the Gospel as it looked 1,800 years ago. And there's Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century codex that's probably our earliest example of what we'd call a Bible, meaning that in one single volume, it includes a Genesis to Revelation copy, and on top of that, it took 260 sheep to make. Now, I don't want to bleed around the bush, but that's a big project, right? Thank you. I'm here all weekend. Or we could talk about P1, the first page of the Gospel of Matthew, dug up from the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, on January 12th, 1897, and dated to the beginning of the 3rd century. It's the very first papyri to be discovered and cataloged in the modern numbering system that we use as the standard for ancient Christian papyri. I could talk about GA777, a more than 1,000-year-old copy of the Gospel collection with one of our earliest illuminated manuscripts, which alongside the Greek text has detailed paintings of events throughout Jesus' life. I could keep going. This stuff is really fun. But what I want to actually capitalize on is not any of those, but something a lot smaller. And this is one of my favorite manuscripts. This is actually a manuscript that I made a facsimile, a copy of, and gave to Joe Rogan. I took authentic Egyptian papyrus and I transcribed the text of this particular manuscript. I framed it and I gave it to Joe and got that excellent photo of him holding it up. Thank you, Joe Rogan. This is P52. P52, also known as John Rylands 457, is a fragmentary piece of papyrus that is housed in the John Rylands Library of Manchester, England. It was discovered in 1934 by a guy named C.H. Roberts. And after Roberts was recently doctored, he was rummaging through the drawers full of manuscripts in the basement of the library at the John Rylands Library. And what he discovered was a tiny credit card-sized manuscript that had been discovered in Egypt years before, but had been just put in this drawer and housed away for later study. And as he looked on it, he noticed that it was written on both sides. Now, because of the script, which was ancient Greek, and because of it being written on both sides, it was identified as coming from a book. Ancient antiquity, the scroll, or what's sometimes called the book roll, was far and away the preferred medium of writing. We now think of books like this, right? This is, we have it bound on one side, and we have writing on both pages. This is the norm now. This is what scholars refer to as a codex, because we like to refer to things in Latin. And codex means book in Latin. And so in a codex, we start to see these being used within an early period by Christians. Christians did not invent the book within the ancient world, but they almost certainly popularized it. And so for this small scrap to be written on both sides, it indicated that it had a strong chance of being a Christian writing. And sure enough, it was, containing the text of John 18. Now, just about a century prior to Roberts making the discovery of P52, there was a man named Ferdinand Bauer in Germany, and he had come up with a theory. Now, Bauer was a student of a guy named Hegel, and Hegel was a philosopher that came up with what we refer to as Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic has the idea of you have a thesis and an antithesis, and then you bridge it in the middle by a synthesis. You might have heard about this kind of in just regular writing and maybe argumentation. And he surmised, based on this theory from his mentor, that Mark portrayed a very Jewish Jesus. Mark's biography of Jesus, the Gospel of Mark, portrayed a very Jewish Jesus. Luke, he thought, portrayed a very Gentile Jesus. And so, based on that, he said, well, Mark and Luke and then John, interestingly enough, portrays both a kind of Jewish and Gentile Jesus. And so in his estimation, John was the synthesis. And based on that, he said that John could not be dated any earlier than 160 to 170 AD. Now, the events of Jesus happened at the beginning of the first century, somewhere between 5 BC and 33 AD. And so, what we have going on here is well outside of the time frame of the life of Jesus and or the eyewitnesses. And so, based on that, based on this Hegelian dialectic, he concluded that John could not be in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses and therefore had no historical value in terms of telling us anything about the historical Jesus. Now, this became the consensus for a lot of scholarship within this time period, within the 19th century. This became kind of the standard articulation. You had the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John's way out there, and it's very different, and it's written far too late to give us anything of valid detail of who Jesus actually was. The problem was P52 is discovered and it's dated to the beginning of the 2nd century, approximately. What that does is, at minimum, now I went to high school in Elliott Lake, but I was told that copies come after originals. Even in Elliott Lake they teach that. And so, logically concluding something like the Gospel of John, if P52 is from the 2nd century, it means that it's more than likely that the actual copy of John that John wrote, especially if John was writing in Ephesus, which is where he's traditionally associated with, and then that is being copied and is moving around geographically to eventually get to either the Fayum or the Oxyrhynchus area of Upper Egypt, you have to allow for time. And so based on that, it's not that much of a stretch to say John was probably written in the 1st century. The later dating puts it at the end of the first century. But John, according to early church testimony, he's said to have lived very, very long. He's said to have died not as a martyr per se, but in exile, like on the island of Patmos. So this gives credibility to this. Now, what I'm not saying, don't hear me, that there is no argument as to the dating of P52. As scholars, you get 5 scholars in a room, you have 7 different opinions. There's always going to be individuals that have a pushback on the dating of P52. But the consensus to this day is still it's 2nd century. Now, we can argue where in the 2nd century that is, but it's still 2nd century. And so this tiny credit card size fragment of the Gospel of John goes a long way in terms of validating things for what we think about generally in terms of the Gospels being early eyewitness testimony. Now, in one way, I would say that your English Bible has been changed. But what I mean by that is maybe not what you're thinking if you just hear me say that comment off the cuff. And let me illustrate this to you by reading for you Psalm 23. I quoted at the event last night. Psalm 23 from a very old Bible, from a Bible from the 9th century. It reads like this: Drayton mi ret, ni beith mi nains goodswan, and he me geset on swaith good foland, and fed me by water stratham. Right? Sometimes you read a Bible verse that hits you right here. Is that Psalm 23? Yes. Is that English? Yes. But it's not English as it looks like today, is it? It's Old English. And there's a very big difference between the Wycliffe Bible and my modern ESV that I'm holding this morning. And in that sense, the Bible has changed, but it's changed for the sake of clarity, not corruption. Bible updates are a good thing in that they're not trying to change the Word of God. They're trying to change its updated meaning in order that you can actually understand it and apply it to your life, to be able to practically use it and read it and it be understandable. This is a good thing. And in this way, I think, despite a skeptic saying the Bible has been changed for corruption, I would say that the English Bible has been changed for the sake of clarity, which is a separate issue than is what we have now, what the original authors wrote. But I think we can say that what we have now is what the original authors wrote, that we have this giant body of collection of manuscripts, and we can use the science and art of something like text criticism, which is the inspection of these particular manuscripts, looking at the text, or you have obscure people like me who study scribal features, and so we can comment on these types of things and give a conclusion of the Bible being true and communicating accurately. I think that's a reality. Now, finally, does the Bible communicate truth in conveying honestly? And this is a bit of a different direction. You see, one of the most striking things about the Bible that really sets it apart from other religious and ancient texts is the honesty it conveys concerning its heroes. A primary theme of Scripture is that the greatest individuals spoken about in and through its pages are broken and flawed. Abraham was the father of a nation, and he was a liar. Jacob was a patriarch of Israel, and he stole his brother's birthright. Moses was a Jew brought the Jews out of captivity, and he was a murderer. David was the greatest king God's people had ever seen, and at the same time, a serial adulterer. Noah was the only righteous person left on the earth, and he was a drunk. Peter was part of Jesus' inner circle, and when things got tough, chose to deny he knew him. And Paul was commissioned to write more Holy Scripture than any other New Testament figure, and before his Damascus Road experience was a legalist and a persecutor of Christians. You read other religious texts, and you don't find it being this transparent about the individuals within its pages. This is one of the reasons why my Muslim friends are quite sure that the Bible cannot be true, is because they look at prophets as examples, and you would not have these particular examples of flawed and broken individuals being the individuals who God chooses to carry his message. They say that's one reason why Christianity can't be true. In the ancient world, we heard Scott talk about it. Kings very rarely, and that's a hyperbolic statement, show themselves in a negative light. They don't do that, right? Even King Sennacherib, you won't find examples of losses written by the Assyrians. It doesn't happen that way. Even we have some instances where there's almost like a tie, and both sides portrayed as if, they're so righteous and gracious, they actually let the other person live. People don't do these things, and yet time and time again, We see God's chosen people. We see the prophets. We see the kings. We see the nation as a whole falling short, not living up to the standard, being chastised for these things. That's not something you find in other ancient religious texts. That's not something you find in other religious literature. I want to align myself with a text that conveys about the honesty of the human condition. Because guess what? Left to my own devices, I know how bad I can be. I know that my heart is deceitful and wicked. I know that I'm going to choose sin and hell 100% of the time if left to my own devices. I am. I'm going to do it. And I'm kidding myself if I'm trying to cover that fact up. And yet, the message of the Bible is so clear and something that I find so beautiful in that all of these individuals, it's not about them. They're shadows of something greater because it's about Jesus. It's not about any of the one prophet or king or ruler or judge. It's about Jesus. And I think that's something that if we're talking about conveying honesty, I think we can truly say the Bible is very tacitly honest with its portrayal of both people within history and the human condition as a whole. Now, let me wrap up this particular talk by just highlighting one thing, because if you were to walk out of this room this afternoon and believe that the Bible was a collection of generally historically reliable documents, that even maybe some of them have early eyewitness testimony woven into its pages, if that was your conclusion, you walked out of the room thinking that, I probably would have failed in my objective and motive this morning. Why is that? Well, because the Bible is no less than that, but the Bible is so much more than that. Because from Genesis to Revelation, it's all pointing to a question that Jesus himself turns to his disciples right in the middle of the Gospel of Mark and asks, "Who do you say that I am?" That's what this is all about. That's what we find within the pages of Scripture. Of course, Jesus is a historical character. I think that's verified and backed up by the evidence. But Jesus is no less than a historical character because he's so much more than a historical character. Because Jesus claimed pretty audacious things. He fulfilled prophecy in his life, and then he predicted his own death and resurrection, and people who rise from the dead have more credibility and authority than people who don't rise from the dead. You don't need a doctorate degree to figure that one out. And so it means something. All the stuff we've been talking about means something, right? 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." We have reasons. We do. It's substantiated by fields like psychology and archaeology and history and so on and so forth, science. But it goes beyond that because it comes down to a question that we need to ask ourselves. If all of that stuff is true, that's great. What do we do with it? What do we do walking out into a broken yet beautiful world? How do we communicate these things? Because Jesus stepped out of his throne in eternity and entered into humanity and took on our depravity and took the just punishment that we deserve so that we can become right with God. That's a reality. And he sits now at the right hand of the Father Almighty interceding on our behalf. That's what this is all about. Who do you say that I am? That's the question we should all be thinking about when we look at all of this data, all of this evidence, all of these facts. Because the Bible is no less than a historical book, because it's so much more. Jesus is no less than a historical character, but he's also so much more. You've been very patient. Thank you so much for listening.